Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for this, what is actually the first presentation for 2021 as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Happy New Year, everyone. And once again, thanks for joining me for presentation. And this is actually a presentation that I'm excited about. It's a fun presentation for me, and in part, one of the reasons is that it gave me a good reason to go back and review my photos, essentially to try to remind myself of some of the valuable lessons I've learned along the way, especially those that sort of helped me capture some of my favorite photos. I'm sure I've forgotten a few. I maybe missed some of those in reviewing my photos, but I'll share some of my favorite nuggets of wisdom. First, I do want to thank Irwin for the gift of some delicious coffee from Queen Bean Coffee Company that is helping to fuel today's presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm Tim Grey. Some of you, of course, know me from my Ask Tim Grey email newsletter, which I still find this hard to believe, but I have been publishing this email newsletter, a daily Ask Tim Grey question and answer email newsletter for more than 19 years now. If you're not already getting that daily email and you feel like you'd like more email in your inbox with a question and answer related to photography, you can sign up at asktimgrey.com. I also publish video training courses to help photographers master their workflow in photography, and you can learn more about those at GreyLearning.com. And normally I'd be traveling the world extensively and leading field photography workshops in a variety of locations, but that's on hold right now, of course. But I have been making a lot of online presentations such as this one, including some presentations for camera clubs and at virtual events online. And so if you know of a camera club or an event that I should present for, you can certainly let me know by using the Contact Us link at the bottom of the homepage on the GreyLearning.com website. So having said all that, let's dive in. First and foremost, though, I do want to let you know that if you'd like to ask questions or share some comments along the way, you're certainly welcome to do that. On the right side of your screen, you should see a little question mark icon like this one. And if you click on that, the panel on the right side will open up, and down at the bottom, you can type in your question or comment, and I'll get to as many of those as I can along the way. All right, so let's dive in to consider some of our nuggets of wisdom in photography. And I suppose first and foremost, we should consider what exactly is a nugget of wisdom. I've been gaining nuggets of wisdom, as I call them, in my photography from the very start, but it really became top of mind, this notion of these nuggets of wisdom, when I started leading field photography workshops. Photographers were spending, of course, considerable money to travel and spend a week with me, hoping to improve their photography and capture some great photos along the way. Certainly a lot of pressure involved in trying to make all of that happen for photographers. But over the years, I've realized that if photographers, including myself, can get some good photos and pick up a few small but impactful tips, they'll be happy with their workshop experience, with their photography experience in general. And so, to me, a nugget of wisdom is a little tip that might seem trivial, but that can have a significant impact on your photography. Like the notion that you should always be looking for unique angles for your photos. That's the nugget of wisdom, as it were, that led to this photo, as I was trying to figure out how to find a unique perspective on a building, the World Trade Center Tower, that has been photographed countless times. And so trying to find an interesting angle, and here looking straight up at the building as it forms a sort of pyramid, if you're on the right side, as it were, on a edge as opposed to a corner, I guess you could say, in the context of this building. And so I want to start off with a photo that whenever I share this photo, I like to do so without too much explanation at first. But this is a favorite photo. At least it's a favorite among those that when I first got started in quote-unquote real photography with a high school photography class, this was a favorite. So I like to, sort of tongue-in-cheek mention that this is a favorite photo, and especially in front of a live audience, I'll often get some interesting responses because it's not really that great a photo, but at the time, this was the favorite photo of mine that I had captured. And so I was very fortunate. I had a great photography teacher in high school, Mrs. B, and just using the initial for her anonymity. But I took this picture This is in California, Southern California, where I grew up, and out for a hike in the hills and turned around and saw this sun glistening through the trees. So I captured an image and took it, well, the film, of course, back in the days before digital photography, of black and white film photography, went back to class on Monday and processed the film and made a contact sheet. And even from the contact sheet, I was able to see that there was a starburst. And so I went excitedly to my photography teacher and told her, look what I got. And of course, I don't think she was necessarily impressed, because it was pretty obvious to her I got a starburst or a sunburst effect because the exposure required that I stop down the lens a bit. And so stopping down to a relatively small lens aperture, I got a starburst. And that was one of my first and I think most valuable lessons in photography, is know your gear. Understand your camera gear and how it works. One of the ways I often describe this to photographers is to consider the notion, could you actually configure your camera in the dark, essentially? Could you actually configure particular settings, find the right button in the dark or with your eyes closed? And so really trying to make sure that you understand the gear that is so important in photography. I learned another lesson when I made a larger print of this image and was very excited to see that there were clouds in the distance. I didn't realize it at the time I took the picture. I couldn't see the clouds in the small image from the contact sheet. And so that taught me another valuable lesson, to evaluate the whole frame. And this really is important in a variety of different contexts, where at the time of capture, for example, checking the full scene throughout the entire viewfinder, especially around the edges. When post-processing an image, evaluating a print, check the edges, check all areas of the photo. And so this lesson has been reinforced for me many, many times, but it was one of the earliest nuggets of wisdom that I received in photography. So thanks again, Mrs. B, for being a great photography teacher and getting me started along my way. I've also learned over the years, another valuable lesson is that you should really first and foremost photograph for yourself. I know some of you have seen this image that I've shared a number of times. Very early in my days of presenting to photographers, I was presenting at an event for nature photographers, and I was very proud to be presenting, very excited about the presentation, and shared this image that I was really happy with. And I could hear somebody up near the front whisper, well, not very quietly whisper, because I was able to hear them from the stage, but whisper to their neighbor, "It's not even sharp." And I was crushed. I was just devastated. And it took me a while to sort of get over that and to realize that most important is that I photograph for myself. Most important is that I like my photographs. This was captured, by the way, with a lens baby lens. Many of you may be familiar with, creates a sort of blurred edge effect for the image. And this photo, part of the reason I realized later that this photo is important to me is because it's a unique and important subject for me personally. I was born in Santa Monica, California. This is a sign overlooking or at the entrance of the Santa Monica Pier. I used to build sandcastles in the shade of that pier with my grandmother. So there's all sorts of great memories tied up with this location. And that's why this photo is meaningful and impactful for me. Now, of course, I always hope that others will like my photos. But most important is I want to make sure that I like my photos. So, in many cases, I'm my own best critic or my own worst critic, as the case may be. But again, first and foremost is making sure that you're taking photos that are important to you, you might say. I also think it's important when you're capturing your photos to be present in that moment, to embrace the moment. This is a photo I captured a number of years ago in Japan, in Tokyo, and the experience around it was really incredible. I'd captured this photo, and as I did, just after I'd captured this photo, an elderly Japanese woman from across the courtyard kind of waved at me, signaled me to come over to her, and I thought, oh boy, what have I done? I'm going to get myself in trouble, and I don't even know what I did that was wrong. I was trying to be so careful about being respectful, and I wasn't even probably going to understand her because she didn't speak English, and I certainly didn't speak and don't speak Japanese. But I went over, and she brought me up the steps to a little Buddhist shrine, and she taught me to pray at this shrine without the benefit of language, just through gestures. And I thought it was just such an incredible experience, such a great memory. And of course, as it turned out, I wasn't especially happy with the photo after the fact, but fortunately, with a little help in post-processing, I was able to create a new interpretation of the photo, converting it to black and white with a sepia tone effect and a bit of a vignette to try to recapture the mood of that experience. And so I think, being present and, being aware of what's going on, embracing that moment, trying to have the full experience, capturing photos along the way, and then keeping in mind, too, that you might need some post-processing to realize the full vision of a photo. And another valuable lesson that I've learned repeatedly, I guess you might say, been reminded of numerous times, is that practice makes perfect. This is one of my earliest digital photos. This is from way back in 2003. And I'd like to think that my photography has improved significantly since then. At the time, I was very happy with this photo. Now, to me, it sort of just feels like the branch of an oak tree with some moss on it. But practice. And I think one of the key things that I recommend for photographers is to compose with your eyes, even if you don't have a camera with you. Even if you're not going to be able to take a picture, for example, to consider how would you photograph this subject, and just kind of to be an observer of light at all times and to consider composition at all times, even if you don't have a camera with you. But try to always make sure that you have a camera with you. This photo was captured with a smartphone. This is just after sunset on the island of Capri in Italy, and so I did not have a proper camera, my real camera, as it were, with me. And so, how did I capture a photo? With a smartphone. Well, why didn't I have a camera? Well, as it turns out, this was on the evening of my wedding anniversary, and I did not think it would be wise for me to bring my big digital SLR when we went out for our anniversary dinner on the island of Capri. And so I didn't have my camera, but I did have my smartphone, and so I was able to capture a photo of the beautiful light in the sky. So try to always make sure you have at least, even if it's just a smartphone, that you have some degree of camera with you along the way in your wanderings, when you're exploring, whenever you think there might possibly be a photographic opportunity. I've also learned numerous times, I'll share a few examples here, but numerous times to listen to locals. And so, for example, this is a little piazza in Rome, Italy. You can see a line of people at this door. That door is not going to open for any of these people, but they're waiting patiently, most of them patiently, in line to get the opportunity to go up to this door so that they can put their eye, and for some of us, their camera, up to the keyhole of this door and look through that keyhole at St. Peter's Basilica, through the keyhole, through this little tunnel of a hedge, essentially, and get this, what I consider to be a very wonderful view just to experience, but also nice to photograph. And I would never have known probably about this view if not for taking a tour with a local. I'd already been to Rome many times and felt that I knew Rome pretty well. In fact, had already led field photography workshops in Rome, but I was so happy that during that tour, we visited this location, and I've added it now to one of my list of favorite locations in all of Rome. It really is, I think, a remarkable sight to see, to be sure. Another experience, I had the opportunity to visit South Korea. I was actually teaching on board a cruise ship, so making several stops, and I posted a photo online to either Instagram or Facebook and had shared one of the photos, and someone wrote to me and said, "Hey, are you going to be in Busan?" And I said, "Well, yes, in fact, I'm going to be there, the next day probably." And she said, "Well, I can introduce you to a couple of locals who can take you around." And as it turned out, they were not exactly local. They weren't from South Korea, but they lived in South Korea, and they knew the area very well, took me to a variety of interesting locations, including this very colorful neighborhood viewed from a great coffee shop. And So I was grateful that, well, number one, that I had gotten the introduction, that I had taken advantage of that, and that I let them take me around town. And as we were parting ways, as I was heading back to the ship, they asked what time we were departing, and I told them what time that was going to be. And they said, "Oh, that's too bad because you're going to miss out the bridge that you're going to pass under as you depart the harbor on the ship. At night, it gets lit up in all sorts of great colors. Too bad you're going to miss that." Well, I guess the captain must have known about this and delayed the departure. And so, as it turned out, we were able to actually see that bridge. And I knew that was a possibility. And as the light was fading and it was getting dark, I was excited that I might have the opportunity to actually see this bridge lit up. And it was a beautiful sight to see. Beautiful colors that were constantly changing, by the way, transitioning across the bridge itself. And so I was able to capture some photos as we departed, which I would have never known about. I might have just been, sitting down to dinner or something and not even paying attention to what we might pass along the way. But the bridge was fun to see. And another experience, visiting a little town in Namibia, and I didn't think I was really going to have much to see. And someone said, "You've got to go to the ghost town," which I didn't really even know about. And she showed me some photos of the ghost town, and I recognized it as something that I was familiar with, but somehow in my mind it was in the desert Southwest. It's actually a ghost town. It was a diamond mining community called Kolmanskop in Namibia, and it was abandoned decades ago, but the buildings remain. And of course, as sand dunes tend to do, they're taking over. As the wind blows that sand around, it's collecting inside these buildings. And the buildings, of course, getting weathered along the way. And it's really a fascinating place to explore and to photograph. All right. And then when I say Ron's question, was there something inherent in photographic opportunities that caused you to leave Southern California for New York City? And I actually, by way of Seattle for a bit of time there and have since departed New York City. But no, that was purely other opportunities and the photography along the way. All right, another great tip, I simply call this move. Some of you have seen this example. If you've ever been to Seattle, you've probably photographed this scene, or if you've ever seen a postcard of Seattle, there's a very good chance that this scene was reflected in those postcards, or at least one of those postcards. This is a very common view. This is from the hilltop at Cary Park in Seattle, and this is the way the scene is very often photographed, and it drives me crazy because the Space Needle is overlapping with the building in the background. If you just move to the right a little bit, you can get that Space Needle out into the clear in between those buildings, avoiding that awkward intersection, for example. And so trying to be thoughtful, I've talked to many photographers in photo workshops. When I see them find something catches their eye, and they stop right where they are. Maybe they set up a tripod and they capture an image without even contemplating, should I get higher or lower, or move to the right or the left, get closer, further away? How can I adjust my position to get a better photo? Sometimes it's relatively obvious that you need to move. So here, for example, well, it was, at least I was thoughtful about that intersection. It was obvious where I wanted to be. Another example would be in the town of Hallstatt in Austria in the Alps, and just this really quaint, beautiful town right on the water's edge, right on the edge of these mountains that seem to go straight up. And wandering through town, I knew that I wasn't getting a good angle. I needed to find a better angle from which to photograph the town. Fortunately, it was possible to get a boat and take that out onto the water and find a better angle from which to photograph the town with lovely reflections on the water. And so sometimes it's obvious. I wasn't getting a shot that really encapsulated the town when I was in the middle of the town. I needed to get out onto the water, which fortunately was possible without having to go swimming. And in other situations, it might not be as obvious. It might not be as obvious that you either need to move around to get a better angle, or that it would be beneficial, or that it might represent just another possibility for the scene. And speaking of sort of moving around and essentially working that scene, I really recommend that you work a scene like you're never going to be able to photograph that scene again, like you'll never see that location again. So the pin at the center of the map here that's colored yellow rather than orange is obviously a location, as you can see, that is out there essentially seemingly in the middle of nowhere. That would be Easter Island, way off the coast of Chile in South America. Well, the island itself being just out there in the middle of nowhere, but Chile being in South America. And so I had this opportunity to spend a couple of days on Easter Island during an extended trip, and I knew that there was a very good chance that this would be the only time that I was able to visit Easter Island. And so I tried very hard to make sure that I was able to see all there was to see and create photographs that I would be happy with. I certainly did not want to get home regretting that I didn't create the right photograph of a scene, that I had sort of missed out on an opportunity, or that I was disappointed with the photos that I had captured. I was very mindful of this along the way as I was photographing on Easter Island. A remarkable place to visit, of course, and a remarkable place to photograph, and I'm happy with the photos that I got there. And then along the way, of course, working a scene is to consider, what are the other right answers? So some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with DeWitt Jones, great photographer and great presenter, and he talks about the right answer and that there's more than one right answer for a given subject or for a given scene. And so, here obviously, Venice in Italy, and my mind's still on that keyhole view in Rome. So Venice in Italy, as we all know, and there's some rather obvious photos, right? We want to photograph the gondolas and the canals and the colorful buildings, but it's important also to be on the lookout for the other right answer, for other possibilities, for other subjects. And in many cases, I try to focus on what are the maybe not so obvious photographic opportunities. And so exploring around Venice and wandering across the bridges and along the canals and getting lost, because if you didn't get lost in Venice, you probably weren't actually in Venice. It's an easy place to get lost in, but in the best way possible. And so I found this little canal off the beaten path a little bit, and there were beautiful buildings with vibrant, bright colors, yellow and green. And so I was photographing the overall scene, and then I realized, just the building itself was pretty interesting. But actually even more interesting in my mind at the time was the reflections on the water in the canal itself. And so here's one of the photos that I came up with of those reflections, which sort of just looks like an abstract painting almost. You would never know this was Venice. You would never know it was Italy. You'd know it was water probably, that it was reflections, but not necessarily know what it was a reflection of. And I think in many cases, sort of a bonus tip you might say is that we forget that when we photograph a place or a subject, the photograph doesn't necessarily need to be obvious that, the image is from a particular place. It doesn't need to be an obvious reflection, no pun intended, of the subject. So this is a photo that doesn't say, I think, to the average viewer, certainly, this is Venice, Italy. It is just hopefully an interesting and colorful photo. And so keeping in mind that, of course, you want photos, I'm sure, if you're traveling for photography, you want photos that show what it was like to be in that place, what the place looked like, but there's more than one right answer for any given location or subject. And so trying to, come up with as many right answers as you can, essentially. I see the comment from Mary Ellen that the stories behind the photos are so important. I totally agree. And that photographing for yourself and being present and embracing are helpful tips. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Glad to know those are helpful. And here's another tip that I hope will be helpful. You've got to pay attention. And it's in quotes for a reason, because this wasn't something that I came up with during a trip. I had the great opportunity to visit South Africa to speak at an event there, and which was a long journey. I was living in the Seattle area at the time, so to Johannesburg, South Africa by way of Amsterdam from Seattle, a very long journey. And so ahead of time, I said, boy, it's a really long journey because after arriving in Johannesburg, there was still something like a 5 or 6 hour drive to get to the Mkhubeskloof, which I had to practice at the time. I'm still probably not pronouncing it very well, but it was a very long journey. And so I expressed this to the group that was inviting me. And they said, well, can you stay for a few extra days and we'll take you out on safari? I said, absolutely. What a great experience. And out on that vehicle during those early mornings and long days, we heard one of the leaders very often telling us, you've got to pay attention. You've got to pay attention for subjects that you might not have even realized were out there in the bush and for potential opportunities. Now, of course, when you're in a vehicle with a lion sitting under a tree in the shade, just kind of hanging out, there's a good chance at some point they're going to yawn. So you're just sitting there attentively waiting. But beyond that, just being aware of possibilities, always be watching for a photographic opportunity, paying attention, and ideally having your camera ready, which is another tip that I've learned over the years. In fact, I worked with George Lepp, a nature photographer some of you may be familiar with many, many years ago. And he taught me that you've always got to have your camera. Whenever you put your camera away, always have your camera ready for your next shot. As best you can, try to anticipate what that next shot is going to be, what sort of subject you're going to be photographing next, and try to have that camera configured for that purpose, essentially. Oh, and a good question from Ray. Other than cropping, I'm not a follower of significant post-processing. What minimum adjustments do you recommend? And I would say, the core adjustments would really be overall tonality, getting the exposure and the tonal range distribution optimal for the photo, getting the color both accurate and appealing, and then correcting for any errors. So, for example, I like to apply profile-based lens corrections to most images in order to compensate for the behavior of the lens. And otherwise, just following your vision for the photo. And that might mean minimal processing. It might mean significant processing. It's all about what is it that essentially you want to accomplish. And when I'm processing a photo, I try to be mindful of sort of the mood of the photo and what I'm trying to convey. Photographers often talk about what's the story behind the photo? And I usually don't have really a story per se, but, what is it that I want to express through that photo? All right, another tip that I actually learned a long time ago. This was also a tip that I learned from George Lepp when I was working with him very, very early in my photographic career, as it were. And I would go out and assist him with some photo shoots, and he would ask me if I could grab something out of his bag. And so I'd open it up, grab whatever he needed, bring it to him, and he would admonish me, close the bag every time. Never leave your camera bag open. So I learned that lesson very, very early. But apparently, I forgot that lesson. I was on a video shoot in Graz in Austria, and we had a film crew that was filming me doing some travel tip videos. And we had stopped to photograph this Glockenspiel tower, this clock tower. And then we had lunch in this little square. And the crew stopped for a cigarette after our lunch. And I decided that I wanted to photograph in the square and thought, well, maybe a wider view would be interesting. And so I got my camera bag, my backpack, and opened it up. I was using a 24-105 lens that I put into the bag, took out a wide angle, a 10 to 24 millimeter, 10 to 22, I think it was, millimeter lens on a crop sensor, so it translates to 16 plus millimeter, and captured some photos. The funny part, I guess you could say, is that the photos weren't even very good, as you can see for yourself. Not exactly a photo that is going to win any awards or that I'm really ever going to do anything with other than something like this. I'll highlight, you might notice an issue here that I'll address in a separate tip. But the photos were just, I was just playing around, thought maybe a wider view might work. It really didn't work. And so the crew then, as I wrap up a couple wide-angle shots, the crew, one of the guys says, hey, we're going to get some footage of you just walking down the street taking pictures. So just walk down the street, pretend like you're taking pictures. We'll film you from behind and get some B-roll, essentially, of you photographing. I said, sure, no problem. grab my backpack, fling it over my shoulder, and hear a crashing sound, which didn't alarm me. I just thought that my backpack, my tripod rather, had come loose from the straps on the backpack and fallen to the ground. Not a big deal. Probably got dinged up a little bit, but not a big problem. But, in fact, it was not my tripod. It was that 24-105 lens that I had set in the backpack, but I did not close. Even though I had learned that lesson long, long ago, I did not close the backpack. And so always close that camera bag, zip it up, snap it shut, whatever the case might be. I know in this case, I thought I'm just going to swap lenses for just a minute, take a few photos, swap lenses back, and then I'll close up the bag. Then you get distracted by something. You can see the front lens element came all the way out, and I couldn't even get this fixed in time. I was the following week leading a field photography workshop in Austria, and so there was no time even to get what is my most commonly used walkabout lens. Couldn't get it fixed in time for that workshop. So I was reminded of that lesson that I had somehow managed to forget along the way, but certainly I know Mark had reminded me of this tip. Thanks for that reminder that I had shared this in the past, and definitely one of the more valuable tips, to be sure. And also, lock your car. So I was presenting at another event. This was in Palm Springs. Well, this is Joshua Tree. Some of you, of course, recognize Joshua Tree National Park. But I was presenting at an event in Palm Springs, California. And as is often the case, I have presented at many events where I fly in, I go to my hotel, I go to the venue for the event, I go back to the hotel, I go back to the airport, and I leave, and I get home and realize I never actually saw that place. I did a presentation a long time ago in St. Louis and never saw the arch. Well, I have seen it since, but I got home and said, wait, what was I thinking? Why didn't I go and explore a little bit, at least for some photographs? And so I got to Palm Springs without really thinking of it. I had even grown up in Southern California, would go out to the high desert periodically, and realized, wait a minute, I'm really close to Joshua Tree. I should go out tomorrow for sunrise. And of course, it's the desert, so it's always hot in the desert, right? Well, not before sunrise in the high desert, it's not, which gives us a bonus tip of always make sure that you pack appropriate clothes, which might mean you need to really give some thought to what's the weather really going to be like. And to me, I didn't think that I would need to be prepared for cold weather because I was presenting indoors and in a place that's quote-unquote always hot out in the desert. It's not always hot, especially at night, but I decided to go out there anyway. All I had was a hoodie, no jacket, no gloves. But get out there, and I figure I'll just photograph Joshua trees from the side of the road. And so I found a nice little spot that looked good just before sunrise, pull over into a turnout, grab my camera, and head out, and tripod, and head out into the desert there and set up a photo, but it wasn't quite right. I saw a better tree a little further away, so I went over to that one, and it still wasn't quite right. And this continues on. I end up about a half a mile from my car and realize I don't think I locked the car, and I left my camera bag in the back seat of the car, and every now and then I would hear a car driving and wondered if somebody was going to steal my camera bag. Fortunately, I got back and the camera bag was still there and zipped up, by the way, but be sure to lock your car when you're getting out. Even though you think you might just be photographing at the side of the road, you might find yourself venturing a little further away, so keep that gear safe. And also, I mentioned the glockenspiel wide-angle photo, another little tip that image conveyed that you might have noticed. Clean your lens. I know we often, just think about point and shoot. You don't have to worry about the lens. If there's something on the lens, it's going to be rendered out of focus anyway. But especially if you're going to include, for example, the sun in the frame. Here, playing around with some cow's parsnip out in the Palouse, probably got some pollen from the flowers on the front element of my lens, and so you can see up in the sky there, these little lit up orbs, these little bright spots in the sky that sort of look like dust spots. Well, essentially they are dust, but being illuminated by the sun, creating sort of similar to lens flare, essentially. And so it's a good idea to make sure your lens is clean in general, but especially if you're going to include the sun or some bright light source in the frame, something like this where those spots are really just going to get lit up all the more. So anytime I include the sun in the frame, I try to make a point of using a lens cloth, for example, to wipe that the front lens element clean and keep the lens clean in general. And speaking of clean, keep your sensor clean too, especially, before an important trip, before a big trip, before any photographic outing. You don't necessarily need to clean your sensor each and every time, but also check your sensor, I should say. So, for example, just stopping down the lens all the way, stopping down that lens aperture to its smallest size, and just photographing a blank wall while moving the camera around a little bit. This photo, I wish I could tell you honestly that this image was just a Photoshop task, essentially, that I added these dust spots to the image. Unfortunately, it was not. I was on a trip and just wasn't thinking how often I ought to be cleaning my sensor, apparently. And so this happens to be on a little boat outing off the coast of Bora Bora in the South Pacific, and seeing really beautiful scenery along the way and doing some snorkeling, and photographed this motion blur of the water that we were moving on, and was horrified to later discover just how much the sensor was full of little dust spots. I guess I'd been changing lenses more than I realized and not being careful enough about it. So always make a point of checking that sensor, at least checking before an important photo shoot to make sure it's clean, and then, of course, cleaning it as appropriate. And so I saw there was a question about, what do you clean your lens with? I actually use lens wipes for that purpose, the pre-moistened lens wipes. And similarly, and you can use a similar solution for cleaning your sensor. I use from Photographic Solutions, their sensor swabs, and they're cleaner for that purpose. But yes, making sure that sensor is clean. For a photo like this, of course, relatively easy to clean that up in post-processing, but not something I really want to spend my time doing if I can avoid it at all. Another tip that I learned a long time ago, back before there was back button focus, I guess you could say, meaning before there were buttons for that express purpose, the camera that I was using way back when had a button that was essentially there for custom function purposes, meaning you could essentially sort of program that button to do what you want. And so I learned that could be valuable. And one of the things that I really love about back button focus is that it gives you more flexibility, I find, in my photography. And so the basic process, generally speaking, we'd enable back button focus on your camera if it's so equipped and if it's not on by default, and then to disable autofocus for the shutter release button, so that the only way to focus is with the back button. Now that brings up I guess you could say, a bonus tip. Make sure before you commit to using back button focus that you get in the habit of doing it to the point that it's automatic. If you just switch tomorrow and go out and take pictures, there's a good chance you're going to forget from time to time to actually push that button and achieve autofocus. And I also set the camera to continuous autofocus. Always. I never set my camera to one-shot autofocus. It's always set to continuous. And so one of the great things about that is if I want continuous autofocus, all I have to do is press and hold the back button focus button, and I can focus on my, for example, moving subject as I pan with that subject, maintaining focus on the subject along the way. But I can also get the equivalent of one-shot autofocus at any time. All I have to do is point my camera, my lens, at the subject, so at the abandoned farmhouse here, for example, and then press and hold the back button, autofocus button, until focus is acquired, and then release the button. So focus on the house here, for example, release the back button focus button, and now focus is set at that distance. So I could recompose. So for example, center up the house in the frame, establish focus, recompose the scene, and capture the image. The key, of course, is making sure not to then change your distance to the subject. In other words, focus, of course, is based on distance. And so if I were to then walk closer to or further away from the house, now I'm not focused at the right distance. But again, having that back button focus with continuous autofocus gives you the ability to have more flexibility in your photography. Just make sure, again, that that becomes a good habit so you don't neglect to acquire focus from time to time. I see the question from Anne-Marie about do I clean the sensor manually or just by using the clean sensor button on the camera? And what I do, so my camera is actually configured so that the cleaning happens automatically when I turn on the camera or turn off the camera. And so that's happening periodically in any event. And if that's not automatic on your camera, I'd say certainly use that in-camera cleaning. Most of cameras have now, or many cameras anyhow, have a micro vibration approach where essentially it's shaking off the dust off the sensor, but that won't get everything off, especially if there's any degree of humidity involved, and that won't always do the trick. And so important still to check and possibly manually clean. And good follow-up question from Ron here. Should one try to clean a sensor themselves, or does it need to be done professionally? If you're not sure about it, I would say send it in to your camera manufacturer. Typically will offer, or there's other companies that would offer cleaning services, and let them do it, especially because if you don't send it to your camera manufacturer for cleaning, there's a good chance that cleaning it yourself will void the warranty of the camera. And of course, the interior components on a camera are relatively delicate, so something you want to be extremely careful with. So I do clean my own sensor in large part because I often don't have the luxury of time to send my camera away, etc. And so I do clean myself, but I acknowledge that there's a certain degree of risk, and often you'll find that if you damage your sensor and need to have the sensor replaced, it's cheaper to replace the camera than to have the sensor replaced. So something you want to certainly be very, very careful about, but it can be done yourself as long as you're very, very careful about it. Another good question related to traveling for photography. Sam asks if I make a list of shots you want when traveling to an area. And yes, I try as much as possible. Obviously, in some cases, if I'm traveling to a location I visited, numerous times before, I already know some of the locations I might want to visit. I do tend, though, to have a list in that type of situation when I'm going to be visiting an area, especially for more than a few days, to make sure that I don't forget to capture some of the photos that I want to achieve. And also, then I try to do some research in advance and figure out, what other opportunities might exist that I might have missed in the past, or especially if it's somewhere that's new to me, then I definitely want to try to go in with some sense of, what sort of photos I might want to be capturing. And also, when it comes to focusing, by the way, when it comes to autofocus, initiate that autofocus early, especially with a subject that might be a little bit tricky to achieve consistent and accurate focus. Birds in flight, for example, comes to mind, or this bird in flight, a crop duster. When it's a fast-moving subject, a subject that you might have a little bit of a challenge tracking, you can certainly pre-focus, set your focus to something at the approximate distance. So with this crop duster, for example, before he's even in view, I might focus on a hill in the distance, for example. And then as the crop duster comes into view, initiate that autofocus early. Even if in this case, crop duster is too far away for a good photo, start early with that autofocus and continue tracking that subject along the way. And then, of course, capture the photo at just the right moment, or a little burst of photos, a variety of photos at different moments to try to make sure that you end up with the right frame, the best photo for that subject. I also, here talking about focus, but let's consider a little bit of blur also in the way of motion blur, essentially, a moderately long exposure. I believe this was a 15-second exposure in this case. But I learned a while back the value of neutral density filters. And early on in photography, photographers, especially landscape nature photographers, would talk about graduated split neutral density filters. And to me, those were always frustrating because the shape of the filter, that gradation, never seemed to follow the shape of the landscape or the scene that I was photographing. Whereas with a solid neutral density filter, and of course nowadays I would use HDR, by the way, for a scenario where you might otherwise want a graduated neutral density filter. But a solid neutral density filter enables you to create longer exposures than would otherwise be possible. And of course, sometimes we can just stop down the lens and achieve a reasonably long exposure. In other cases, we might need essentially sunglasses for the lens. And so I actually carry with me a 10-stop neutral density filter uh, density value of 3 that enables me, even during daylight conditions, to get around a 15 to a 30-second exposure. And that can be wonderful. So here at the Space Needle in Seattle, of course, and it was a bit breezy and there were some scattered clouds, and you could see that the clouds were actually moving. It was very obvious that they were moving, so I knew there was plenty of movement, but I wanted to really render that with a blur, and so I used that neutral density filter to give me the ability to capture a longer exposure. I see the question here from Antoinette, which I sort of addressed in passing earlier. Do you believe in leaving your camera settings on default? And yes, meaning that I try to anticipate whatever my next shot might be. When in doubt, it's something like f8 and maybe 400 ISO to make sure that I'll have a fast enough shutter speed. And then, of course, when I actually pull my camera out and close the camera bag afterwards and consider the subject I'm photographing, then naturally try to, make sure that I've got the right settings for the circumstances, but trying to have either good default settings or anticipating when you're on your way to photograph a crop duster, for example, thinking about what the shutter speed might need to be, and things like that, and so configuring your camera as best you can in anticipation of those settings. Speaking of shutter speed, I learned very early on also that this rule, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that for handheld photos, if you're not using a tripod, that the shutter speed should equal, so to speak, the focal length. It really is a fraction, of course. So with a 500 millimeter lens, for example, which was used in this case, you want a 1/500th of a second. So at a 200 millimeters, you want a 200th of a second. At 1,000 millimeters, you want a 1,000th of a second. And it's a pretty good general rule. It gives you a pretty good overall sense of whether or not you can handhold with, especially with a long lens, where that any movement of the camera, of the lens, is going to be amplified, essentially. And it's also a good way to sort of consider whether or not a tripod might be in order. If you're maybe not able to achieve a fast enough shutter speed, short enough exposure time, then you might need to use a tripod. But I do find that general rule to be helpful. And when we start getting to the slower shutter speeds, or at least too slow to be handheld, then consider using a tripod. But a really important thing to keep in mind is that tripods aren't stable. Well, okay, they're generally way more stable than hand holding, especially for longer exposures, but don't get complacent. If it's windy, for example, a strong wind can very easily cause enough movement of the lens or even of the tripod itself to render motion in the scene. Or if I've been photographing at night on a bridge overlooking a city, and a bus goes by and you can feel that bridge just kind of, rumbling, vibrating around from the movement of a heavy vehicle. And so making sure that you've got ideally a fast shutter speed, a reasonably fast shutter speed, depending on what you're trying to achieve, even when you're using a tripod. And speaking of, not fast shutter speed, is when it comes to long exposures, I feel that a longer exposure is not necessarily best. In other words, you shouldn't just try to get the longest exposure that you possibly can in order to, render motion with a blur. Here, this is a 15-second exposure, and to me, this was too much for this subject, for this particular scene. This is a stream in the Alps in Austria, and had wonderful alpine color to it, and so 15 seconds just felt like too much. So I went with a shorter exposure, and actually in this case only needed to get a quarter of a second, not even a very long exposure, all things considered, to get nice textures in the water. So sometimes when it comes to long exposures, longer is not necessarily better. And speaking of these camera settings related to exposure, I've really found, especially I'm a fan of narrow depth of field, but I do find that narrow depth of field can very often add impact to a subject. I'd like to think that this subject, this beautiful poppy, would be impactful all by itself, but I really feel that in many cases, narrow depth of field can add a nice impact to a photo. So it's not always about f8 and being there, sometimes opening up that lens aperture to get narrower depth of field, especially when you'll be photographing relatively close to a subject where it's really easy to get a narrow depth of field for that subject. I see the question, by the way, from Brian about low speed or high speed continuous. Well, it says autofocus. I'm assuming you're referring to continuous shooting. And in general, I tend to use the lower speed continuous shooting. as opposed to high-speed continuous. And that's in large part because I usually don't need, hundreds of photos of a given subject. So as long as I can time my shot with reasonable accuracy and things aren't changing super fast, then I'll tend to use that slower speed continuous shooting and only use the high speed when I'm concerned about not being able to get just the right moment. And so I want to make sure that I am, basically breaking down that subject to fractions, tiny fractions of a second to give me the best possibility of getting the right shot, the right moment for that shot. So this would be an example, obviously, of narrow depth of field. Sometimes lots of depth of field is preferred. So understanding hyperfocal distance, and so calculating that hyperfocal distance in order to make sure that you can achieve appropriate depth of field. And so here, for example, calculating out depth of field with a wide angle lens, stopping down to f/22, intending to focus about 5 feet from my subject, and sure enough, I am focusing beyond the hyperfocal distance, which means I'll be able to have everything from my foreground subject all the way to infinity in focus. You can see that the far limit here for depth of field is infinity, and this is actually the scene that I photographed based on that notion of hyperfocal distance. I often hear photographers saying something like, just focus halfway between you and your subject and everything will be in focus. That's not always true. Thinking back to that poppy shot with very narrow depth of field, no matter what I did, where I focused, I was going to have very narrow depth of field because I was focusing very close. And so here I'm just right about at that limit, focusing on the wheat in the foreground about 5 feet away, and I've got everything all the way to infinity in focus based on that notion of hyperfocal distance. So understanding that it's not giving you everything in all situations in terms of that depth of field, but understanding and calculating, I'll talk more about that at the end here, but calculating depth of field can help you achieve the intended result for a scene. And whenever photographing with a wide-angle lens, this is in some ways true in general in photography, I would say, but especially for a wide-angle lens, you want to have a strong foreground. What does that even mean? Basically, it means that the foreground shouldn't be boring, at the very least. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of a foreground that competes with your key subject. Here, for example, I've just got this texture, the rocks in the foreground that I think are interesting, and then that leads in with the stream and the waterfall, of course. The waterfall is the key subject here, but I want to make sure that the foreground, when I'm shooting wide angle, if I've got just just dirt in the foreground, it's going to take up a fair amount of the scene. It's not going to be very interesting. So by and large, in most cases, it's a great bit of advice is to always make sure that you've got a strong foreground, an interesting foreground. It's not universally true, but it's generally helpful, especially for wide-angle photos, to make sure that you've got a foreground that's interesting, or that at least is not boring, that doesn't detract essentially from the photo. And then stick around. I remember back in my early days in photography when I was working with George Lepp, and he would share a story about an experience at Mono Lake in California in the Sierras, and he shared a series of photos, and it looked like the sunset was going to fizzle. I guess you could say sort of like this photo. It doesn't look very promising. Might as well pack it up, right? And he would relay this story of how the other groups had left and they were driving away, and they got to the the edge of the road and made a turn, and then they saw this the color just kept getting better and better and better, but they missed out on it because they didn't stick around for the conditions that might change. So here, this is near Mont Blanc in France, and certainly this seemed hopeless. It's a real interesting little range of mountain peaks, but the conditions are just dreary. Notice, by the way, the shape at the top right. You'll see that shape repeated of that peak there, sort of forms a little table shape, I guess. Whatever you'd call that shape up toward the top right, it sort of stands out. And so it seemed like, this is miserable weather. It's not going to get any better. Might as well pack it in, get a nice dinner with some good French wine. But especially this seems to be true in the mountains, right? They often will tell you, if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes. And for just a few minutes, right around sunset, things got better. Never thought this was going to happen. This is literally at the same time, within about, maybe an hour of that previous photo, the clouds parted enough to let a little bit of light come through. Obviously, the skies had cleared up a little bit. Things had moved on pretty quickly. So I had sort of given up, and we actually were enjoying some wonderful French cuisine and wine, but I did have my camera with me, and so I ventured outside from this restaurant, and it only got better. So you can see at the top right, it's the same peak, and then the light got even better as the sun got a little bit lower. The shadows are starting to go across the landscape, and once again, same shape up there at the top right, and really wonderful late afternoon light just before sunset. A wonderful memory, and thankfully a photograph to preserve that memory, in part because I had stuck around. Which reminds me of, not just sticking around, but turning around. This was when I was teaching on board a cruise ship, Inside Passage of Alaska. I had the opportunity to visit Hubbard Glacier. I was very excited about this, but it's kind of dreary, and it just didn't feel like there were very many photographic opportunities. I tried to photograph the glacier, the wonderful colors and textures, but it just didn't feel like it was quite coming together. It sort of wasn't what I had envisioned originally, but fortunately, turned around, saw this wonderful range of mountain peaks in the background, and using a long lens, a 150 to 600 millimeter lens in this case, zoomed, I believe this was all the way at 600, but in any event, zooming into just that kind of saddle between the peaks, and the white snow with the gray clouds, it all kind of blends together into these shades of gray, and I thought it worked out very, very nicely. And speaking of another example of turning around, so on another cruise opportunity teaching and sailing into Papeete in Tahiti, and I could see even from the ship this setup in this little square with all these little food trucks and whatnot, and I love street food, so I was really excited about this and was noticing this, but fortunately, right around sunset, bothered to turn around and see the island of Moorea behind us with incredible color at sunset and a shadow cast by the peak on Moorea. So just this wonderful opportunity. So always, kind of pay attention and turn around, see what's behind you, see what's in all directions, really, and make the most of the situation. Make the most of the conditions. I'll show you a real extreme example of this a little bit later. But, photographing flowers, this is canola out in the Palouse. You certainly want to make sure that you've got, very calm conditions ideally, so the wind is not moving those flowers around, and you can get a sharp photo. But what happens on a windy day? Well, we can make the most of that situation. Take that wind motion and the flowers dancing around in the breeze and render it as a long exposure blur, a little bit of a blur, so that you've got another interesting perspective on a subject. I also learned a long time ago there's power in planning. I tend to be a planner anyway, maybe an over-planner, but out in the Palouse once again, and one of the fun subjects out in the Palouse are crop dusters, and so we'd be out early morning photographing sunrise, and there'd be a crop duster off in the distance. We'd see if we can get some photographs, and it was very elusive. Of course, if you just pull over and try to photograph too close to a crop duster, he's going to leave and go somewhere else. And so I got to know some of the locals and some of the local crop dusters, and one in particular, was happy to have us out there. We could coordinate, make sure we were in a good position, and so we would plan and try to figure out, what would be a good perspective based on the field he needed to spray on a given day. Where can we be upwind and have the light at our back ideally so that we can get some good photos, and ideally from an elevated position. And so we were able to plan ahead and coordinate with this crop duster so that we were able to get some good photos, and this being one of my favorites of my a good friend, the crop duster out there in the Palouse, spraying a field, and we're up on this hilltop and able to set him against this hillside of wheat in the background that worked out very nicely, including the contrails, the not contrails, but the wingtip vortices, I should say, those curls, those wisps of spray coming up off the wingtips there, which was all made possible essentially by planning and coordinating. Speaking of planning, of course, sometimes I forget to plan, and so I don't think about something necessarily. So, for example, not looking up in advance to figure out, when is there going to be a full moon. But the sun and the moon are very, very predictable. And so I saw the question earlier about what weather app I recommend. I generally use an app called WeatherBug. I also look up aviation weather from a variety of, from aviation weather sources, because that tends to give you a little bit more detail. But when it comes, as long as the weather cooperates, the sun and moon are quite predictable. You can anticipate years in advance when there's going to be a full moon. You can anticipate certainly what time the sun's going to set. Here out in the Palouse, going to a favorite sunrise subject and saw the moon was very nearly full. And so I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize we were going to have a full moon. So a couple days later, returning to a favorite sunrise subject to photograph the full moon as it was setting just after sunrise. And so you can plan, there's a variety of ways you can do this, but one of those is with an app for smartphones, both Android and iOS, iPhone, called PhotoPills. I've got a video course, in fact, at timgray.me/pills. You can learn about that course, a comprehensive course that covers all sorts of different planning aspects with PhotoPills. But here, you can see, you might recognize this as being Rome. You can see the line from the push pin there indicating the direction of the moon on a date when there was going to be a full moon. So the full moon was going to be rising shortly after sunset, and I knew that in advance, and so I was able to use this planning tool to figure out a good position from which to photograph the full moon, and then I was able to actually capture photos of that full moon. That came from planning, of course. However, the weather's not always very predictable, and sometimes luck plays an important role in photography. And so I was leading a field photography workshop in New York City, of course. You might recognize this as a view from the Dumbo neighborhood of Brooklyn in New York City, looking at the lower Manhattan skyline. And, whenever I'm leading a field photography workshop, one of the things I obsess about the most is the weather. And during this particular workshop, the weather was not cooperating very much. And so I was trying to, kind of make the best of it. What's the best day to go to Brooklyn, to go over to, across the Hudson to photograph the skyline, to go to Central Park? And some of it just wasn't working out great. And on this particular day, when I decided, well, let's take a chance and go over to Brooklyn for the skyline view with the Brooklyn Bridge, there was severe thunderstorms in the area. But I tracked the weather obsessively and anticipated what sort of window we would have before the thunderstorms arrived. So we went over, photographed some of our late afternoon subjects over in Brooklyn, and then had a reservation for the group for dinner. I encouraged the group to take their sweet time and enjoy their dinner, have a beer or a glass of wine, and we're going to wait out the storm. And sure enough, while we were eating, tremendous thunderstorms and very heavy rain and lightning. And of course, all the locals and the tourists who hadn't been paying attention to the weather were caught off guard and were getting drenched and trying to come into the restaurant, anywhere that was open. We were comfortably sitting at our table. And then after the rain passed and the sky started looking like this, we had transitioned to a coffee shop right at the waterfront. And I said, let's head outside now. It's still raining just very, very lightly, but the color's starting to come up. I think we might end up with some good color, and we most certainly did. Not only did we end up with some good color, luckily, but I had set up my camera to capture essentially a time lapse of bracketed exposures so that I could help my students, my workshop participants, while still having my camera capture some photos for myself. So I'm alongside one of my workshop participants, assisting with their camera settings, reviewing their images, and a lightning bolt strikes that tower of the World Trade Center. And right afterwards, after the peal of thunder, I hear the click of my shutter. But I don't know if it's opening or closing. Fortunately, it was closing. And fortunately, it just so happened that the exposure worked. In other words, a bracketed exposure, but one frame, when the one frame that included the lightning was actually a reasonably good exposure overall. So I will take luck in photography any day. And in fact, after the sunset, you can still see very bright, distant sky there with the sun not quite set. But after the sunset, the color shifted and got equally interesting and wonderful, these wonderful pastel tones and colors in the sky. And then I think, one of the best tips, and, obviously I've shared a number of photos, some of my favorite photos along the way, and some photographic opportunities that came from planning, some that came mostly from luck, maybe a little bit of planning. But I think the best part overall in my photography, and I think in yours as well, is that the best photos are still waiting to be captured. And, I have this notion that I'll never capture my best photo because my favorite right now won't be my favorite probably next year, because hopefully I'll capture an even better photo that I like even more by that time. And so I encourage you to take all these tips I've shared and the other lessons you've learned and the lessons I've forgotten about that I would have shared if I had remembered, and try to make a point of always be improving your craft in photography. And so thank you very much for joining me today. I know we've got some questions here, so I'll try to get to as many of these as possible. I see Dave's question here for crop sensors. What is the focal length shutter speed rule? I actually use the same rule in terms of that focal length and shutter speed. In fact, I have often kind of try to take that a step further and double it, meaning if it's a 500 millimeter lens, I try to aim for 1,000th of a second rather than 500th. And for crop sensors, conceptually, you could say that it would be that you would need a faster shutter speed because you're cropping the scene, but it's still the same image circle in terms of the field of view of the lens itself. And so I would say that the rule still sort of applies the same. It wouldn't make a dramatic difference in that respect. And so a question from Sandy here, what do you mean by narrow depth of field? That would be where we do not have very much in focus in the frame. So depth of field refers to how much of the scene is actually in focus. And so here, essentially, this photo that you see of that full moon rising in Rome, Italy, you could say that basically everything is in focus, whereas that poppy flower, you saw that just a very, very narrow range of the flower itself was in focus, had a very, very narrow range in focus. Yes, a great point, Mark, that suggests varying handheld fast shutter speeds with water flowing and other scenes and see what looks the most interesting. So I used an example of a longer shutter speed with the flowing water in the Alps, but certainly sometimes the exact opposite works well. So when you're using that rule of thumb about handheld fast shutter speeds, using that for a fast-moving subject, trying to freeze some of the motion actually can work very nicely as well. And while I'm looking at these questions, by the way, I want to mention too, I mentioned the PhotoPills app. So just as a reminder, that link that I shared earlier, timgray.me/pills, will take you to the GreyLearning website, to the course, the comprehensive course that has, I think it's about 5 hours worth of content to help you make the most of this really powerful app called PhotoPills. The course is called Photo Planning with PhotoPills, and you can get a 34% discount, which will be included automatically if you use this link, timgray.me/pills, to get started. Let's see here. Yes, do you use a macro lens with image stabilization? So yes, I actually don't tend to do a tremendous amount of macro or close-up photography, but one of the best kept secrets, actually, a good tip that I could have included if I had thought of that, is that a macro lens makes for a great landscape lens or portrait lens. Macro lenses tend to be among the sharpest lens, having the greatest sharpness. And so when in doubt, if you've got a 100 millimeter macro, that's a great 100 millimeter landscape lens or a nature photography lens or whatever the case might be. And I saw Susan's question about understanding hyperfocal distance and calculating hyperfocal distance, and that is included with PhotoPills. So PhotoPills is what enabled me to plan that shot of the full moon rising, for example. So you can plan for sunrise and sunset or figure out when the sun will be up above the terrain and those sorts of things. But you can also calculate exposure and perform a variety of other calculations, determine field of view, calculate. So there's a table that'll help you better understand the impact of various settings on hyperfocal distance, and a calculator that you can use to calculate that hyperfocal distance. So I see a few people were asking about that calculation for hyperfocal distance, and so I use the screenshot actually that I included there was a different app that I've used to demonstrate the concepts of hyperfocal distance, but I use PhotoPills to actually use that to make those calculations when needed. Yeah, great point, George. Another tip is using depth of field preview And absolutely, depth of field preview. So when you might not realize, well, of course, some of you I know are using mirrorless cameras, but for those of us using digital SLRs, you might not realize, well, cameras in general, that when you're looking through the viewfinder, the view you're seeing is based on the lens aperture being wide open. When you actually take the picture, the lens stops down based on the setting you've established, takes the picture, and opens back up again. And so many cameras have a depth of field preview feature where you can essentially close the lens aperture while you're looking through the viewfinder. With a digital SLR, that can be a little tricky because now you've stopped down the lens, you've significantly potentially reduced the amount of light coming through the lens, and therefore it's very difficult now. The scene is too dark for you to really make much sense of. So I use the depth of field preview in conjunction with the live view display so that I can see a preview of that depth of field on my camera's LCD display. So those of you with a mirrorless camera, you probably kind of just have that as an automatic. You don't think too much of it. But for those of you using digital SLRs, that can be very helpful. Ralph's asking what exposure mode I use the most. And so this obviously is going to be something that is just a matter of personal preference when it comes to your exposure configuration. I use aperture priority the most. And the reason for that is kind of just the way I think about my exposure in photography. Number one is I'm usually prioritizing depth of field. I'm very often thinking about depth of field in the context of configuring my exposure, my overall shot. And so that's sort of one of the more important settings for me is that lens aperture. But also I tend to think about exposure compensation. And certainly you can apply exposure compensation based on the meter reading in manual mode. But I just find that it's quicker for me to think about the exposure in terms of how do I need to compensate for the way the camera is interpreting the exposure based on the camera's meter. And so I more often than not, almost not exclusively, but I would say the majority of the time, use aperture priority in conjunction with exposure compensation. And then a fair percentage of the time, I'll switch to manual mode when it's expedient to do so. Jack's asking about what shutter speed for airplanes. Well, that depends. If it's a jet-powered airplane, then I would say the fastest shutter speed you can manage is usually a good thing, especially if it's a fast-moving jet. For propeller-driven airplanes, it will depend on the speed that the propeller is turning, which does vary depending on the airplane. For example, turboprop airplanes, the propeller tends to spin pretty fast. As a general rule, I would say no faster than about a 2/50th of a second. Because if you go too fast with the shutter speed for a propeller-driven airplane, you're going to freeze the motion of that propeller, and it suddenly looks like the pilot is having a very bad day. And so I would say that right about 2/50th, it will vary. So check your work, essentially. And sometimes you'll want a little bit slower. Very often, though, we're trying to get a fast shutter speed to freeze the airplane, but we don't want it too fast that we freeze the propeller. And yeah, so William's asking if there's a good app for sunset cloud prediction by location. So a couple things. There is an app called Photocast, spelled with an O, Photocast. I know it's available for iPhone. I'm not certain if it is available for Android or not, but that does pretty good. But I also very strongly recommend, there's a variety of sources of aviation weather. And so that tends to be a good source of information, more detailed information about the weather. And so if you can find a plain language website, so the weather information, the way it's distributed is essentially a whole bunch of abbreviations. And so if you didn't have any training as a pilot, you wouldn't be familiar with that. But there are some sites out there you can find that give you that interpreted version, that plain language version. Which I don't know a site because I just look at the actual reports themselves, but that it will give you, for example, cloud heights. Also, knowing the difference between the temperature and the dew point will give you an estimation of the cloud height as well. So those sorts of things can be helpful. And let's see here. When do you use focus stacking? Good question. I don't tend to use focus stacking all that often, usually just for macro or close-up where it's virtually impossible to get a lot of depth of field. And so then you can essentially bracket your focus, your depth of field, and then put those images together in post-processing. And Richard's asking if I use live view more than the eyepiece. I don't. I generally use the eyepiece much more than live view, partly because when you're out in daylight conditions, sometimes that live view can be a little bit difficult to see, partly just old habit, because I've been photographing since the days before having a digital camera with an LCD. Shutter speed for the canola in the wind. Good question that I actually don't remember. I believe it was right about 1 second. It wasn't a tremendously long exposure, and it was helped with a neutral density filter. All right. And where do you share photos you've taken primarily? I share primarily on Instagram, so if anyone wants to follow me and check out some of my favorite photos that I share from time to time on Instagram, you can find me as Tim Grey Photo. All one word. Just remember that Grey is EY, and Tim Grey Photo on Instagram and on most other social media platforms as well. And let's see here. I asked you a couple questions about that blurred canola. And yeah, so with some cameras, I should say, more than a burst of about 4 shots. So I usually recommend, so with something like the crop duster, for example, I generally recommend that you capture short little bursts of photos so that you don't fill up your buffer. And so what you'll find, let's say you're using high-speed continuous shooting, for example, then you may find that you press and hold the shutter release and you're capturing a series of photos in rapid succession, and then the camera stops and tells you it's busy, and you've got to wait till the memory buffer in the camera is cleared before you can capture additional photos. And so if you run into that type of situation, you can certainly test that just by capturing in burst mode and seeing how long you can hold the button before it stops. It relates to how much buffer memory the camera has. And so if your camera is so affected, then I would encourage you to capture little bursts of photos at what you think are the right moment, as your subject is, flying across the scene, for example, if it were a crop duster or a bird. Of course, when I talk about that, then a photographer will want to show off, and they'll show me how with their camera, because with some cameras, you never run out of buffer. You can press and hold that shutter release and capture high-speed continuous photos until you run out of memory on your memory card. And so for some photographers, it's not an issue, but with many cameras, of course, that is a concern. And we'll wrap this up with, two quick questions here that I do want to address. So Bob asks if I ever use auto ISO so you can adjust shutter and f-stop independently. I don't tend to use auto ISO, even though you can limit that range of ISOs so that you don't end up with too much noise, for example. To me, it just becomes one more thing that is variable, and so I usually dial in an ISO setting that will work for the general lighting conditions and then adjust aperture and shutter speed, whether I'm in aperture priority mode, where I'm essentially just adjusting my aperture and exposure compensation, or in manual, where I'm adjusting shutter and the lens aperture. So my personal preference is not to use auto ISO, but many photographers make use of it and swear by it. And so if you find that it's helpful, certainly I would not discourage that. I just don't find that it suits my way of thinking, essentially, when it comes to photography. And finally, a question here from Stephanie related to composition. With the crop duster, it was essentially centered in the frame. When would you consider disregarding that rule of thirds? Well, obviously in that case, and you might recall the photo of the egret in early morning light, kind of a purplish light where it was very close to the edge of the frame, ready to fly out of the frame. That sort of violates that rule of thirds as well. In general, I would just say the rule of thirds is great, meaning don't center your subject in most cases, but sometimes the center is just the right place. And it's hard to describe, but it just feels like that's the right position. So as a general rule, don't just bullseye your subject. Don't just put your subject in the center of the frame, but rather be thoughtful about what might be the best position. And being off-center is often good. Being in a corner is often good, not right up against the corner generally, but being thoughtful about, how can I frame this up? And some of that relates to what's surrounding that scene that might also contribute to a good photograph that you want to include versus exclude from the scene. And so I would say, having a subject along one of the 1/3 lines, if you imagine a grid of thirds on the image, that's good, but don't think of it as I must put the subject right on a third line. Think of it as I generally don't want the subject centered, and corners are often nice as well. Again, not right up against the edge of the photo in the corner, but off center, off toward one of the corners of the frame. And playing around with that a little bit, and practicing, as I mentioned earlier, can also be very helpful in terms of improving your photography. All right, so we've gone way over time, longer than expected, but I did tell you this was going to be a fun presentation for me. I hope it was a fun and helpful presentation for you. Thank you once again for joining me, and do check out, if you haven't already, the PhotoPills course, Photo Planning with PhotoPills, or if you're a subscriber to my GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle, that includes that photo video course on PhotoPills as well. So thank you once again for joining me, and I know there's some additional questions. I'll try to address some of those in upcoming Ask Tim Gray email newsletters, so stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more presentations in the very near future as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. In the meantime, thanks very much for joining me today.